April 12th, 1945. A gray, cold morning at a U.S. POW camp on the Gulf Coast. They expected screams, barking dogs, and punishment, everything their training had warned them about. Instead, they smelled stew, warm, rich, impossible in a world built on fear and hunger. The air was thick with diesel, the clang of metal trays, and a tense silence that pressed against their heart. Women who had been taught that surrender meant shame now shuffled into a bright mess hall, hands trembling. A bowl of meat and potatoes waited for them, food that could fill more than their empty stomachs. Some cried, some ate slowly, unable to believe it. They came as enemies, symbols of a defeated army. They left that table questioning everything they had been taught about honor and mercy. This was real life, not propaganda, and it would change them forever. If you want to hear the full story of how mercy and food shattered a lifetime of fear, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and watch till the very end. August 1945. The war in Europe had ended, but for thousands of captured Germans, the war inside them had not. When the U.S. Army trucks rolled into the Mississippi camp that morning, their cargo was not weapons, not ammunition, but women in gray uniforms, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht captured in France and North Africa. Some were barely 20, others had husbands still missing on the Eastern Front. As the trucks slowed near the gates, the women fell silent. The tall wire fences shimmered in the heat. A wooden sign read, U.S. Army Internment Camp. They could smell diesel and dust. From inside came voices speaking English, the metallic rhythm of hammers, and, faintly, the smell of food. Most of them had not eaten properly in days. Inside the truck, someone whispered, "They say Americans hate us." Another replied softly, "They say they shoot prisoners." Those were the rumors they had grown up with. For years, German propaganda had painted America as a land of greed and chaos, a place where women were shameless and prisoners were treated worse than animals. Posters had shown blonde soldiers beaten and mocked by grinning Allied guards. They had believed it. Now, as the truck doors opened, those images clung to their minds like shadows. The women climbed down slowly, clutching what little they owned. A small bundle of clothes, a photo, a rosary. One nurse from Hamburg, Ingrid Weber, later wrote in her diary, "We stepped onto American soil with shaking knees. I expected to be spat on, but instead of rage, there was order." U.S. soldiers stood in clean uniforms, their rifles slung loosely. One young sergeant, barely older than the women, motioned with his hand and said, "Line up, please." The word please surprised them. It was not shouted. It was spoken. Each prisoner was searched gently and given a tag, POW-W-314, POW-W-315, and so on. Their names were written on a ledger. A medic checked their temperature. Another noted down illnesses. When a woman fainted from heat, 2 American nurses ran forward, fanning her and offering water. The German women watched, confused. In their minds, enemies were supposed to be cruel. These Americans, with their calm eyes and steady voices, did not fit the story. They were then taken to a long wooden building. Inside, cots stood in neat rows, each with a folded wool blanket and a bar of soap. On one wall hung a poster showing camp rules under the Geneva Convention, translated into German. It said clearly, "Prisoners of war will receive medical care, food, clothing, and humane treatment." The women stared at that sign. One of them murmured, "This cannot be real." Outside, the Mississippi sun was blazing. Guards handed out tin cups of cold water and slices of white bread. For many, it was the first time they had seen white bread since 1943. In Germany, rations had shrunk to 1,000 calories a day. Bread was dark and mixed with sawdust flour. Here, the bread was soft, the crust golden. It tasted foreign and kind. As the women ate, the guard towers stood watch but quiet. There were no dogs, no shouting, no humiliation, just the hum of cicadas and the clatter of metal trays from the distant mess hall. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, they were counted again. One American lieutenant told them through an interpreter, "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to law. You are safe here, safe." It was a word they had almost forgotten. That night, Ingrid lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling. The cot creaked beneath her. The smell of disinfectant and soap filled the air. Outside, she could hear faint laughter from the American barracks, men talking about baseball, about home, about girls waiting for them. She whispered to the woman beside her, "They sound like us." The woman nodded silently, and for the first time since surrendering, Ingrid felt something strange inside her. Not fear, but curiosity. These were the enemy, yet they behaved like decent men. In her small diary, she wrote one line before falling asleep. If this is captivity, what was freedom? But this was only the beginning. The next morning, the gates would open to a new kind of shock, one that would change everything they believed about their conquerors and about themselves. Morning came with the sound of boots on gravel and the low hum of engines. The women lined up outside the barracks, squinting against the bright southern sun. The air smelled of pine, damp wood, and something cooking, maybe coffee. It was quiet, too quiet for a prison camp. No shouting, no barking orders, only a steady rhythm of footsteps and the distant clang of metal trays. An American sergeant walked past, holding a clipboard. He nodded politely and said, "Good morning," in English. The women stood stiff, unsure if it was a test. A few whispered back, "Guten Morgen," but their voices barely rose above the breeze. Each woman went through registration again. A short interview, a photograph, a fingerprint. They were asked their names, birthplaces, and wartime roles. A translator, a soft-spoken man from Chicago who spoke German, helped the process. He smiled as he spoke. "Don't worry," he said. "You'll get food soon." That word again. Food? It sounded almost unbelievable. Back home, rations had run out. Many of them had survived on turnip soup and old bread crusts. Here in the enemy's camp, the air already smelled like stew. After registration, the guards led them toward the mess area. The camp itself looked more like a small town than a prison. Neatly painted huts, vegetable gardens, laundry lines, even a wooden chapel. American soldiers worked side by side with prisoners, hammering fences, stacking crates, carrying buckets of water. Ingrid noticed one detail that confused her deeply. Everywhere she looked, there were smiles, not mockery, just calm, ordinary smiles. The guards were young, boys from Kansas, Ohio, and Texas, who seemed more curious than hateful. As they passed by the kitchen, a large man in a white apron looked out. His name tag said Henderson. He waved his ladle and joked, "Don't worry, ladies, we don't bite." The interpreter translated. Some of the women tried not to laugh. Others stared in disbelief. When they reached the mess hall, they were told to sit on benches under the shade. A few guards brought buckets of cold water with tin cups. One by one, they passed them out. The first sip tasted like metal and freedom. One woman, a former radio operator named Helga, whispered, "They treat us better than our own officers did." Another added softly, "Maybe they don't see us as enemies anymore." Inside the kitchen, the cooks worked fast, ladling thick stew, cutting bread, boiling coffee. To the women, it was an unreal sight. Americans feeding Germans with the war barely over. They watched steam rise from the pots, the smell of onions and beef filling the air. Some tried not to look hungry, holding their posture, trying to keep what little dignity they had left. Then came another small gesture. An American nurse walked among them, offering handkerchiefs and small bars of soap. The wrappers said, "Made in Chicago." The women turned them over in their hands, reading the words. It was the first clean, perfumed soap they had seen in years. Many had forgotten what such things smelled like. One woman began to cry quietly, her hands shaking as she held the bar. "It smells like flowers," she said in German. The guard nearby didn't understand her words, but he smiled anyway. After the short break, the women were shown around the camp. There were medical tents, washrooms, and a sewing area. They were told that, once processed, they could work in the kitchen, fields, or laundry, and they would receive small tokens they could use at the camp store. Some of them nodded politely, still unsure if any of this was real. At midday, the interpreter gathered them and said, "Tonight, you will receive your first proper meal." The women exchanged glances. Some didn't believe it. Others dared to hope. Ingrid wrote that evening, "They speak to us like people. I don't know how to act. We were told to expect hatred, but instead we are given water, food, and kindness. It feels wrong to accept it, but I cannot refuse." The camp quieted after sunset. A soft rain began to fall, tapping against the tin roofs. The guards walked their rounds with flashlights, their beams cutting through the mist. From the kitchen came the smell of something cooking: potatoes, meat, and maybe bread. Tomorrow would bring the moment that none of them could have imagined. The first true meal served by the very men they once called the enemy. And for many, that moment would change them forever. Weeks earlier, before the camp, their journey had begun across the ocean. The war was ending in Europe, but ships still carried thousands of German prisoners toward America. For many, it was the longest, strangest trip of their lives. The women boarded at the French port of Le Havre. The harbor smelled of oil and smoke. The sky was gray, full of gulls and drifting ash. Allied soldiers shouted orders while groups of prisoners, men and women, moved up the gangways carrying only small satchels. A Red Cross nurse checked each name. Their destination was listed simply as USA. Few of them had ever seen the ocean before. To them, it felt like being taken to another planet. One woman whispered, "Maybe they are sending us to factories." Another replied, "Or to dig graves." The ship, a converted troop carrier, had steel floors, narrow bunks, and the smell of salt and iron everywhere. The waves rocked it day and night. Many became seasick. Buckets clattered along the floors. Guards, mostly young Navy sailors, passed water and bread through open hatches. Ingrid remembered one guard who gave her an extra apple and said softly, "Don't worry, it's almost over." She didn't know if he meant the war or the voyage, but his kindness stayed with her. Inside the cargo hold, light came only from small vents near the ceiling. The women sat close together, talking in low voices. Some tried to pray. Others hummed old German songs. When storms hit, water leaked through seams, and the floor shook with each crash of the waves. The sound was deafening, metal groaning, waves pounding, people coughing in the dark. After the first week, the mood changed. They realized they were not being mistreated. The guards didn't shout. No one hit them. Each morning, they were allowed on deck for air. The wind was cold, but the open sky gave them relief. For the first time in months, they saw horizon and light. The ocean stretched forever, a deep blue field of foam. One sailor offered cigarettes to a small group of German women, pointing to his own and smiling. They accepted with shy hand. It was a wordless moment of peace between enemies. As the ship neared the American coast, tension rose again. The women crowded along the rail, expecting a gray, hostile land. Instead, they saw green. Rolling hills, pine trees, small houses, even children waving from a dock. One woman covered her mouth, whispering, "It looks like home." When they finally docked, American officers stood waiting, clipboards in hand. No guns were pointed. They were called by number, helped down the gangway, and given water bottles. A medical officer checked their eyes and hands for signs of malnutrition. Another took their temperature with quiet efficiency. An officer from the U.S. Army told them through a translator, "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. No harm will come to you. Follow instructions, and you will be safe." For many, those words felt impossible. After years of Nazi propaganda, safety in an enemy land seemed unreal, but every hour proved the promise true. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for the long journey inland. The carriages were clean and cool. Windows were open to the breeze. They passed through farmland, small towns, and rivers that glowed in the evening sun. Children along the tracks waved. Some of the German women, without thinking, waved back. At one stop, a guard handed out sandwiches, white bread, meat, mustard, and small paper cups of coffee. Helga wrote later in her notes, "It was the first warm coffee I had tasted in years. We were still prisoners, but for a moment, I felt like a guest. By the time they reached Mississippi, fear had dulled into confusion. They had crossed an ocean expecting punishment and pain, but found something gentler. The American landscape felt vast and calm. When the train doors opened at the camp, they smelled earth and pine, not smoke. The guards waited quietly, not rushing anyone. They stepped onto the soil of their enemy's homeland and found to their surprise, that the ground felt no different under their feet. For the women who had lost everything, the journey across the Atlantic marked the beginning of something unexpected, the slow, uncertain rediscovery of trust. The sea had separated them from war. Now, the land ahead would test what they truly believed about mercy. The next morning began with a whistle, not of warning, but of breakfast. The women stood outside the barracks, still unsure if they had heard correctly. Guards waved them toward the large wooden building at the center of the camp, the mess hall. Sunlight glinted on the tin roof. The smell drifting from inside was rich and unfamiliar. Beef, onions, and something buttery. Inside, rows of long tables stretched from wall to wall. Metal trays were stacked neatly beside them. American soldiers stood behind counters, ladles in hand. The noise was calm, dishes clinking, voices low, steam rising from pots. The German women entered slowly, still expecting a trick or humiliation. One guard, a young man from Ohio, nodded to the first woman in line. "Step forward, ma'am." The translator repeated his words in German. The woman hesitated, then stepped forward. She was handed a tray, heavy, warm from the steam, and then a ladle dipped deep into a pot of thick beef stew. Potatoes, carrots, and small pieces of meat filled her plate. A slice of white bread followed, then a spoonful of something sweet, applesauce. The woman stared at it for several seconds before whispering, "Is this for us?" The translator nodded. "Yes, eat around her." Others moved through the line in silence. Each received the same: stew, bread, coffee. The smell filled the air, thick and comforting. It was the smell of home, not war. They sat together at one long table. The first spoonful went down slowly, as if they were afraid it might be taken away. Then another, then another. The taste hit them like memory. Warm, salty, full of life. Ingrid wrote later, "I took one bite, and the tears came without warning. I had forgotten how food could taste like kindness." One by one, others broke down too. Some wept quietly into their sleeves. Others laughed nervously, not knowing how to handle the flood of feeling. A guard nearby watched them in silence. He turned to another soldier and said, "They're crying over stew." The other replied softly, "Wouldn't you?" In the corner, the camp cook, a large man named Henderson, wiped his hands on his apron and watched. He had spent weeks cooking for American troops who complained about everything. Now, for the first time, someone was grateful. He walked to the table, leaned down, and said through the translator, "There's more if you want." A few of the women nodded quickly. One whispered, "Thank you." It was the first English word she had spoken aloud. As they ate, conversation began in whispers. Some compared flavors to what they once cooked at home. "It tastes like my mother's soup." Others wondered where the ingredients came from. In Germany, food had become gray and tasteless. Here, the stew had color and warmth. It wasn't just the food that touched them, it was the way it was served. No shouting, no orders barked, no guards watching them chew. Just calm, ordinary men doing their jobs. After the meal, the women were given time to wash their trays. Near the sinks, they found small bars of soap again, scented, pale yellow, smooth to the touch. One sniff brought back memories of markets before the war. Another woman murmured, "I had forgotten the smell of clean." Later that day, the camp commander visited. Through the translator, he spoke simply, "You are not here for punishment. You are here until your country can bring you home. You will work, you will eat, and you will be treated with respect." The words were heavy with meaning. Respect. The same women who had been trained to believe that Americans were monsters now found themselves being offered dignity and dessert. That evening, as the sun fell behind the tall pines, they sat quietly outside the barracks. The sound of music drifted from the American side, a harmonica playing a slow tune. One of the women hummed along, recognizing the melody. For a moment, there was no war, no enemy, just people sharing the same twilight. Ingrid wrote again that night, "I thought surrender would be the end, but today I began to feel human again." The next days would bring work, routines, and letters from home, all reminders that the world outside still existed. Yet none of those moments would ever erase the memory of that first meal, when a bowl of stew broke down years of fear. For them, mercy had arrived not through speeches or peace treaties, but through ladles and bread. Days in the camp soon found a rhythm. Mornings began with roll call, followed by work in the kitchens, laundries, or vegetable gardens. Afternoons were quieter. Women mended clothes, wrote letters, or simply sat under the shade of pine trees. For the first time in years, they were not hiding from bombs or ration lines. Life was still confined by fences, but those fences now felt strangely safe. A few weeks after arrival, the American command announced that all prisoners could send letters home. Each woman was given one sheet of paper, one envelope, and a pencil. The paper had printed rules: no military secrets, no insults, English or German only. But beyond that, they were free to write whatever they wished. At first, many didn't know what to say. What could they tell their families in a country they had once believed was winning the war? Then one woman began to write, and soon every bunk filled with the soft sound of scratching pencils. The first lines were hesitant. "I am alive. The Americans treat us fairly. We have food. We sleep in beds." Some letters included small, almost unbelievable details. One woman described her first American meal, a thick soup with meat and real potatoes. Another mentioned the soft white bread, so fresh I could smell the butter. These words would travel across the ocean through sensors into the hands of families still surrounded by ruin. For those who received them, it was like reading from another world, one where former enemies were being fed and treated kindly. Inside the camp, the act of writing itself changed the women. For years, their words had been filled with slogans and fear. Now they were free to write about ordinary things: the sound of the wind, the color of the soup, the way the guards sometimes smiled. The letters were small windows into a new kind of life, one that still seemed unreal. A young woman named Margaret wrote in her diary, "I never thought I'd use the word thankful again. But today, as I wrote to my mother, I found myself writing those very words. Even the guards noticed the change. At first, they had been careful, distant, unsure how to treat their female prisoners. But as the weeks passed, their interaction softened. Some helped translate letters or explained English words. Others slipped extra stamps or paper to those who wanted to write again. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was understanding. The camp's postal office recorded nearly 200 letters in the first month. Each one passed through military censors who cut out forbidden lines with neat scissors. The rest were stamped and shipped through neutral countries to Germany. One American officer later recalled, "We thought we were just handling mail. We didn't realize we were carrying hope." Sometimes letters came back from Germany, thin, worn envelopes with shaky handwriting. "We are alive. The house is gone, but we are safe." When the women read them, they often cried quietly, clutching the paper as if it were the last piece of home. The paradox grew clearer every day. They were prisoners, yet they lived better than many civilians in their homeland. In Germany, rations were still thin, 1,000 calories a day, mostly bread and potatoes. In the camp, meals averaged nearly double that. The women knew it. They felt it in their strength returning, their faces softening, their skin no longer gray. Some began to gain weight again, a strange luxury after years of hunger. Others found joy in small camp routines: morning coffee, washing clothes with real soap, walking under trees that smelled of pine instead of smoke. And yet, guilt often followed the comfort. Many felt torn between relief and shame. How could they live well while their families still starved? Margaret wrote again, "I do not know how to feel. Each spoonful of food reminds me of those who have none." Still, the letters continued. Words became bridges between broken worlds, one made of rubble, the other of recovery. The camp commander encouraged it, believing that truth, even small truth, could undo years of lies. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the loudspeakers played a slow jazz tune, the women gathered outside the mess hall. Some read aloud new replies from home. Others simply listened. In those quiet moments, the camp did not feel like a prison. It felt like a place where human hearts were slowly waking up. For the Americans watching, the transformation was equally strange. These were the same people they had fought against, Yet now they looked like neighbors, and as more letters crossed the ocean, a quiet truth spread that even in war's aftermath, compassion was still stronger than hatred. The women didn't know it yet, but those letters would become their first step toward freedom. Not the kind given by release papers, but the kind that begins inside the soul. As weeks turned into months, life inside the camp began to feel almost normal. Every morning, a whistle blew at sunrise. The women lined up for roll call, then headed to their assigned duties, some to the fields, others to the laundry, kitchen, or workshop. What began as simple labor slowly became something more, a way to feel useful again. Work was not punishment here. The Americans made sure every job had purpose. In the fields, women tended vegetable gardens that fed both prisoners and soldiers. In the sewing rooms, they repaired uniforms and stitched blankets. Those who spoke some English helped in the office or library. The atmosphere was calm, almost cooperative. One woman, Helga, later wrote, "For the first time, my hands built something instead of tearing it apart." The paradox was striking. They had come as captives, yet work gave them back their pride. The camp's records showed remarkable efficiency. By late 1945, prisoners had planted over 20 acres of vegetables and repaired more than 3,000 uniforms. At first, some found the rules strange. They had been told that Americans were cruel, that prisoners would starve. But in this camp, every worker received fair portions of food and breaks during the day. Guards supervised, but without shouting. If someone fell ill, they were sent to the camp hospital, clean, stocked, and run by nurses who treated everyone the same. Margaret, who worked in the laundry, noticed something else. The guards say, "Please," and "Thank you." No German officer ever said that to us. Every sound in the camp told a story. The hum of sewing machines, the splash of water in wash tubs, the rhythmic digging in the gardens, all replaced the noise of sirens and explosions they once knew. For the first time in years, there was peace in their daily rhythm. Some of the American officers encouraged education. They opened small classes for English, basic math, and even history. A few women joined, curious about the language of their former enemies. Soon, they began to read American magazines and newspapers left behind by soldiers. They saw photographs of cities untouched by bombing, shops filled with goods, children eating ice cream, families smiling freely. For many, it was the first time they truly understood how different life in America was from what Nazi propaganda had shown them. One article described American women working in factories and voting in elections. It shocked them. Back home, they had been told women's only duty was to serve men and raise children for the Führer. Helga remembered reading that article. We were taught that American women were weak and lazy, but here they stood beside men, building planes and ships. I realized how much we had been lied to. The more they learned, the more their beliefs began to crumble. Some felt angry for being deceived so completely. Others felt relief that a different kind of world existed. The Americans, too, noticed the change. One sergeant wrote home, "You can see it in their eyes." They're learning that kindness isn't weakness. The camp even held small Sunday gatherings. There was no pressure to attend, but many came just to listen to music or watch short films shown by the Red Cross. One film, about rebuilding Europe, showed people of different nations working together. When the lights came back on, the women sat in silence. A few whispered, "Could that ever be us?" In the evenings after work, they often gathered near the fence and talked quietly. They shared stories of homes lost, brothers missing, and cities destroyed. But slowly, the tone changed. Less bitterness, more reflection. They began to see that the enemy was not the people across the ocean, but the ideas that had blinded them. One night, Ingrid summed it up simply. "We were proud of being Germans, but here we are learning to be human." By late 1945, inspectors from the International Red Cross visited the camp. They noted excellent hygiene, fair food, and humane treatment. To the women, this was more than a report. It was proof that decency could survive even after the worst war in history. Their hands were still rough from work, their uniforms still marked with the black PW letters. Yet, inside, something was healing. Each task, each meal, each polite word from a guard chipped away at the hatred they had been taught. They no longer counted days until release. They began counting small blessings, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of laughter in the mess hall, the feeling of waking up unafraid. And although none of them said it aloud, many began to wonder, if their families could see how they lived now, would they still believe the same things they once did? That question lingered quietly, like a seed waiting for spring. Winter came to the camp quietly. Snow gathered on the roofs, softening the fences and guard towers. The air smelled of pine smoke and warm soup. Inside the barracks, the women sat close to the stoves, writing letters, mending clothes, or talking about life before the war. The walls that once divided prisoners and guards were slowly fading, not the fences, but the ones inside the heart. By now, everyone in the camp had fallen into routine: work, meals, letters, and rest. Yet something deeper was happening. The women were beginning to see their guards not as conquerors, but as people. And many of the Americans, still young and homesick, began to see the women as something more than enemy prisoners. It started with small moments. One cold morning, a guard named Frank offered his gloves to a woman shivering during roll call. Another time, the cook shared extra bread when he saw a prisoner coughing. No speeches, no ceremonies, just simple human gestures. Ingrid later wrote, "I could not understand why the men we feared the most were now the ones showing us kindness." During work breaks, guards sometimes talked about home, farms in Kansas, families in Texas, small towns covered in snow. The women listened quietly, surprised at how ordinary their stories sounded. It was not so different from their own. Mothers waiting, brothers lost, homes destroyed. Some guards brought books or magazines for the women to read. One was a Life magazine with pictures of the end of the war, destroyed German cities, starving civilians, and piles of rubble where homes once stood. The women stared at the pages in silence. For the first time, they saw what had truly happened to their country. One whispered, "They told us we were winning until the very end." Another added softly, "We were blind." The paradox was painful. They had been soldiers of a cause that promised greatness, and now they were learning that their enemy had shown them the humanity their own leaders had taken away. The Red Cross soon arranged small cultural exchanges inside the camp. American musicians visited to play songs. The women sang German folk tunes in return. One evening, an American soldier played Silent Night on his harmonica. When the women quietly joined in, singing in their language, the Americans in theirs, the whole camp fell silent. Two sides of a war singing the same song. A sergeant later said, "For a few minutes, it felt like the world had stopped fighting." Education classes also grew. English lessons were now full. The women practiced phrases like "thank you," "good morning," and "I understand." They laughed when their accents came out wrong, and the teachers laughed with them. Small victories built trust. The camp chaplain, who often visited, noticed the change too. In his report he wrote, "These women came here full of fear. They will leave with faith, not in God alone, but in humanity." Some of the women even began helping to teach others, reading letters aloud for those who couldn't read, translating notes between guards and prisoners. It gave them a new sense of purpose, but not everyone felt peace right away. A few still carried bitterness and shame. One evening, Margaret said quietly, "I cannot forgive myself. My brother died in this war. How can I sit here at home? But I do not know what home means anymore." The final weeks in the camp were filled with mixed feelings. The women cleaned their barracks, folded their few belongings, and returned books and uniforms. The Americans arranged transport trucks to take them to ships bound for Europe. But before departure, the camp commander gathered everyone in the yard for a farewell. He spoke through a translator. "You came here as prisoners of war. You leave as women who helped us rebuild something better. Remember this, peace is not given by governments. It begins in how we treat each other." The women listened silently. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes. It was strange to feel respect for the man who had once been their warden, yet that was exactly what they felt. respect, and gratitude. On their last night, the mess hall served one final meal: stew, bread, and coffee, the same as their first day. But this time, there was no fear, only memory. They talked quietly about their months in America, the gardens they had worked in, the English words they had learned, the small kindnesses that had changed them. Margaret said softly, "It was food that broke the hate." Another replied, "And work that gave it meaning." As they ate, guards came by to shake hands and say goodbye. Some gave them small gifts: a handkerchief, a chocolate bar, a photo of the camp dog. Simple things, yet deeply human. The next morning, before sunrise, the trucks rolled in. The women climbed aboard, holding their few belongings, letters, notebooks, and bits of hope. As they passed through the gates for the last time, they looked back at the camp. The watchtowers stood still. The American flag moved gently in the wind. Ingrid later described that moment. The fence, that once felt like a prison, now looked like protection. I realized it had not trapped me. It had saved what was left of my humanity. Their journey home took weeks. Across the Atlantic, they stared at endless water and eat well while he lies in the snow. Her friend replied, "Because if we don't learn from this, then his death means nothing." It was an honest exchange, one that showed how deeply the war still lived inside them. Forgiveness was not easy. It came slowly, like spring after a long winter. Even the Americans struggled. Some guards had lost friends in Europe. Some had fought in battles where German soldiers killed men they knew. Yet now, they stood face to face with German women, mothers, sisters, daughters, who were simply trying to survive. Private Miller once said to another guard, "I fought Germans for 2 years. I never thought I'd share coffee with one." And yet, he did. Many did. By early 1946, when news spread that some prisoners would soon be released or transferred, emotions ran high. The women felt relief, but also sadness. The camp, once a symbol of defeat, had become a strange kind of home. Ingrid wrote one final diary entry before her departure. "I arrived here afraid. I leave here changed. The Americans did not break us. They showed us who we could be." As she boarded the truck that would take her to the port, she looked back at the camp, at the wooden barracks, the mess hall, the pine trees dusted with snow. What once felt like a prison now looked like a place of rebirth. For many of them, this journey had turned enemies into teachers, fences into lessons, and meals into moments of truth. They had entered the camp as soldiers of a defeated nation. They were leaving as witnesses of a better humanity. Spring came with soft winds and green fields beyond the fences. The war had ended almost a year ago, and now the camps were slowly emptying. Orders arrived that many German women would soon be sent back home. The news spread quietly at first, a few whispers, then smiles, then tears. Some cried from joy, others from fear. Joy because they would see their families again. Fear because they did not know what kind of world waited for them. Germany was no longer the country they had left. Cities were in ruins. Food was scarce. Many had lost everything. Ingrid wrote in her notebook, "We are going home," and thought about what waited ahead. Many wondered if people back home would believe their stories. Could they tell them that the enemy had fed them, taught them, treated them with care? Would anyone understand? When they reached Germany, reality hit hard. Towns were still ruins. Streets were filled with hungry children and homeless families. Some women walked for days to find relatives. Others learned their families were gone. Yet, even in that despair, they carried something different inside, a quiet strength they had learned in America. They wrote letters again, this time not from prison, but from freedom. Ingrid wrote, "I saw the face of mercy in a place I expected to find hate. I will never forget that many tried to rebuild their lives. Some became teachers or nurses. Others worked in aid offices helping war widows and orphans. A few even returned to the United States years later as immigrants, remembering the land that had treated them with unexpected compassion. Historians later studied their experiences and called it a quiet victory, not of weapons, but of ideals. The U.S. had followed the Geneva Conventions closely, feeding and sheltering prisoners even when supplies were tight. More than 400,000 German POWs had been held in America, including several thousand women. Nearly all returned home alive, many with changed hearts. What the Nazis had tried to destroy through lies, the idea of shared humanity, was quietly rebuilt inside those fenced camps. The paradox was complete. They came to America as symbols of defeat. They left as witnesses of freedom. Margaret summed it up best years later. We were told the enemy would break us. Instead, they taught us how to live again. As the story of these women faded into history, one truth remained clear. America's greatest weapon had not been its bombs or armies. It had been its decency. In the end, a warm meal, a kind word, and fair treatment had done what war could not. They turned enemies into human beings again. And as Ingrid once wrote in her final line, "When I tasted that first spoon of stew, I thought it was only food. Now I know it was forgiveness